Welcome to Finsbury Library. My name is Mark Aston. I am the manager here at the Local History Centre and Museum, and it's certainly been my pleasure to make Stanley's acquaintance over the last few months, and it's my pleasure also to introduce Stanley and the talk tonight. I'm going to read a little bit from our blurb to make sure that I haven't sort of misquoted or got it wrong, so if you bear with me. For those who don't know Stanley, author Stanley Underhill is a resident of Islington at Charterhouse, not too far from here, and tonight he's going to give us an illustrated talk about his recent biography, Coming Out of the Black Country. This is a true story and inspiring story about a man born in the 1920s into poverty and who later discovered himself to be a homosexual. Stanley describes his struggle to educate himself and to come to terms with his unwanted sexual orientation, against the background of ignorance, homophobia, and condemnation by the state and church while he battled with depression. So Stanley's going to basically tell the story of his life to this point, I guess. And whilst Stanley is talking, and we also have narrator Stephen, we will be filming. I think we're filming mainly Stanley and Stephen as well, but we will have a Q&A afterwards. Yeah. And for those who may not want to be filmed, just let us know before we start filming. Okay, so without any further ado, I introduce Stanley Underhill.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mark, for inviting me this evening to talk about my book, Coming Out of the Black Country. Also, thank you for coming and braving the weather. It's a very wet evening, by taking the trouble to come to hear me. Instead of just reading excerpts from my book, I thought it might be more interesting to present it in another way. So I brought along with me a friend from Charterhouse, Stephen McGee, and he's going to set the scenes for the stories I'm going to tell you. We've also selected pictures to illustrate the stories. I hope you enjoy the presentation. First, a little about myself and why I wrote the book. I started out life by earning my living at 14 as a compositor in the printing works. After doing national service in the Royal Navy, I trained and qualified as an accountant, finally practicing in the West End. In middle life, I gave into a call which had pursued me from my earliest years to become a priest in the Church of England. To the consternation of my friends and family, I was ordained at Canterbury by the late Archbishop Robert Runcie. I served in the parishes of New Addington, near Croydon, Cannock in the Black Country, Dymchurch on Romney Marsh, Kent, and finally as a chaplain in Minorca, one of the Balearic Islands. I finally retired from active parish life in 2003 and came to live at the historic Charterhouse, an almshouse for elderly gentlemen, now open to ladies, I might add, just down the road from here. I'm now 92. I started writing my book about 6 years ago. The idea was suggested to me by a therapist I consulted from time to time because I was still plagued with periods of deep depression, which began when I was about 30. Initially, the depression was brought about by my inability to accept that I was a homosexual and that my sexual orientation could not be changed, no matter what I did. I was born on the 4th of April 1927 in a small town called Oldbury, about 6 miles northwest of Birmingham, now in what is called the West Midlands. This was the heart of the Black Country, where tanks and munitions were made for 2 world wars. The previous year had witnessed the Great Strike, when all the transport and factory workers came out on strike, together with 300,000 miners who had been locked out by the local pit owners. Unemployment prevailed until the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. As in the miners' strike of the Thatcher era, the gloom that period created still lingered throughout my early years. Although my father had a job, sadly in his early 20s, he had an operation which went wrong and was deemed to be unfit to work for 10 years. Consequently, we were means tested and the family were thrown into extreme poverty. I was born in roughly the centre of this panoramic view, and as you can see on the screen, it was not a very pleasant environment in which to be brought up. One could always smell the effluence from the factory chimneys. When it rained, the muck in the air coated the exterior of the Victorian red brick houses and smudged your washing on the line if the wind changed. This is a typical substandard house in which I was born and lived in the front room until my parents were offered a council house by the local authority. We were very cramped indeed, as my grandfather had another 2 sons and 2 daughters who shared the rest of the house, which only had 2 bedrooms. The only heating was a small fire in the living room and a grate for cooking in the scullery, which was tacked onto the rear of the house. The only means of keeping clean was a cold tap, and the only source of light were a few gas mantles. He went to bed with a candle. The rooms opened directly onto the street or the backyard, and immediately the door was open, the precious heat evaporated. Throughout winters and cold weather, I always felt cold unless I could sit in front of the fire. The outside toilet, known as the privy, was full of cobwebs, soft spiders and earwigs, and a visit there was a terrifying experience for a child. After moving to the council house, eventually a bath was installed. But it was not until I came out of the forces in 1947 that they installed electricity and got rid of those gas mantles. Stephen is going to recall the occasion when my father began to realise that his son was not normal. Stephen.
In the 30s, working-class culture was very suspicious of children who behaved differently from their peers. Furthermore, if the child did not behave according to their parents' expectations, their lives could be made very miserable. I like your Uncle Joe. Or, you don't take after your father, were common expressions about their kids. Stanley's family was no exception. Here is Stanley's story from his childhood, when his father first became aware that Stanley was not normal.
I was about 6 when my Aunt Ella, my father's eldest sister, who never married, took me shopping with her one day. I would not leave the shop until she had bought me a doll. And it meant quite clearly that it was a black doll, dressed in brightly coloured clothes, and it came in a toy wicker pram. When I came home pushing this pram with the doll in it, my father looked at me with utter disbelief. Even now, I can hear him calling to my mother, "Phil, just you come here and look what he's got now." Father was a man of few words and not good at articulating what he felt, but on this occasion his credulity was stretched to the limit. He just could not cope with this girlish behaviour from his son. There's a strange tale sequel to this story of the black doll. I caught the measles and was confined to the bedroom which I shared with my brother. It was winter. To make me more comfortable, my mother lit a fire in the tiny grate in the bedroom. Normally, we could only afford to have a fire in the kitchen. One day, whilst I was still confined to the bedroom, I stripped the doll of her clothes and burnt them in the fire. Then I threw both the doll and the pram, together with the coal from the coal scuttle and the ornaments from the dressing table, out of the bedroom window onto the roof of the bay window beneath. Finally, I moved the bed right up against the wall, the fire grate. At that moment, my mother burst into the room and screamed, "What on earth do you think you're doing? Trying to burn the house down?" Well, make no mistake about it. I got a slap round the ears I never had before. I'm still puzzled about my bizarre behaviour because I was not a destructive child. It might have been something to do with my fever or the boredom of being cooped up alone in the bedroom all day long. But I suspect getting rid of the doll was also a symbolic action, either to regain my father's favour or to protest at my father's increasing alienation from me, which only became more apparent as I got older. I don't know if any of you have seen the film Rocket Man, about the life of Elton John. You remember that early on in the film he portrays very vividly Reggie's rejection by his father. Such emotional damage caused him no end of pain and anger in later life. I shared that experience too. My father always denigrated me, which only increased my confusion and conflict as to who I was.
There is an old saying which sets the next scene. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Don't you believe it? Here is a tale where the wounds go deep and are never forgotten. Stanley would have been about 8 at the time. It was a Sunday morning when it first happened. After attending the morning service at the Methodist Chapel, 8-year-old Stanley used to go and see his grandparents who lived nearby. Walking down Barker Street to the house, he saw in the distance someone ambling towards him. As the figure came nearer, Stanley recognized that it was Barry Groves, the local bully, who was older and much bigger than him.
Barry was swaying from side to side, determined that no one should get past him without a collision. The closer he came, the more threatened I felt. I wanted to make a run for it, but he was determined to keep me in his sights. Our bodies clashed, and his punch sent me flying over the pavement. I heard him burst out laughing and caught a glimpse of him running up the street, waving his arms in the air, triumphant at his latest victim. I managed to pick myself up, recovered my cap, which I found in the gutter some miles away, and ran like the clappers down the dark passage to my grandfather Gray's house at number 93. I burst into the living room and stood there, trembling like a leaf. "What's up with you then?" asked my grandfather in his black country vogue. He was sitting at the dining room table while my grandmother was putting the back stud in the white starch collar and shirt which she had just ironed. Grandfather was dressing up in his Sunday best to go to for his usual drink before dinner at the Bell Inn, the public house at the other end of Barker Street. I mumbled something about being punched by Barry Groves in the street, and Grandfather said, "Why, you're big enough to eat him." His way of saying that I was big enough to eat him, although this was clearly not the case. With that, my grandfather finished dressing, complete with waistcoat, into which he put his half-hunter gold watch and chain, gave me my weekly penny, and left. As he went through the side door into the dark passage, I heard my grandmother shout, "Bob, don't you be late for your dinner." I also beat a hasty retreat.
Stanley was determined to get some education so that he could eventually enter a profession. Otherwise, he would be doomed to spend the rest of his life in a grim factory, like the rest of his family. Underpaid, long hours, and often in appalling conditions. The bullying which Stanley also experienced at school, coupled with the hostility of his father because of his girlish and artistic behaviour, had undermined his confidence. Corporal punishment, meted out by the teachers in those days, did nothing to help him learn. Alas, Stanley could not do his maths. Consequently, he failed to get into the local grammar school. Despite this, he was determined to improve himself, even though he had to go out to work and earn his living in the printing works. Now over to Stanley.
On my 14th birthday, I had to go out and work for a jobbing printer as a compositor, setting type for the printing presses which William Caxton first brought to England in the 15th century. The hours were from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on weekdays and 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Saturdays, with 30 minutes for lunch. The workshop, a former wine merchant's house, was situated in a poor quarter of Birmingham, beside a disused canal, which in the summer gave off a terrible stench. My daily journey by bicycle involved a round trip of 12 miles. On the return journey, I cycled up 4 hills, one of which, Cape Hill, on which the great brewery Mitchells and Butlers once stood, was a very steep incline indeed. My wage was a mere 15 shillings per week, 75 pence in present coinage. I gave my mother 10 shillings and retained 5 shillings for myself. The printing firm which I worked for did not recognise a trade union, and so were able to get away with paying lower wages. The conditions were grim too. For most of the time, the floors of the composing and the machine shops were knee-deep in sheets of inked paper, spoils from the printing presses. My trousers and shoes were frequently covered in wet black ink. Furthermore, the terrible noise from the printing presses and the thump, thump, thump of the guillotine, cutting the huge reams of paper into appropriate sizes, caused the whole building to shake. An unpleasant environment, to be sure, but heaven compared with that of the factory. To improve my education, I insisted on having one-day release from my work at the printers so that I could attend the local technical college. My employer deducted the appropriate fraction from my frugal wage unless I worked overtime to make it up. I also registered for evening classes to improve my English and maths. I prepared for and passed the preliminary examination at the Chartered Institute of Secretaries. In addition, I sat the examinations of the Royal Society of Arts in 6 subjects. After spending 10 hours at the printing works, cycling 6 miles home and swallowing a mouthful of supper, I cycled another couple of miles to the night school in Flash Road, Oldbury. This was my routine in term time for the next 4 years. Ideally, I should have found employment in an office, but I left school without certification of any kind. Furthermore, there were restrictions on moving jobs during the war. Had I left the printers, I might have been directed to work in a munitions factory, which would have meant jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. My father's youngest sister was directed to a factory making munitions. She soon had to leave because the machine oil caused eczema over her face, arms, and hands. Eventually, after passing all these external exams, I was conscripted into the Royal Navy in December 1945 and trained as a naval nurse.
After a few weeks of square bashing, seamanship, and training to be a nurse, Stanley was posted to HMS Queen, an aircraft carrier which had been lent to Britain for the duration of the war but was now being returned to the United States to be recommissioned as a merchant ship. But now for a tale of love at first sight.
During the voyage, I met Alex, whom I fell in love, and it was wonderful. Here how it happened. The ship to which we had been posted had among its passengers GI brides going to meet up with their husbands, American servicemen whom they had married while stationed in the UK. One day, I found one of these brides in a terrible state. She'd fallen down the ship's gangway and fractured her femur. In fact, it was a very nasty fracture indeed. There was blood everywhere. I carried her to the ship's operating theatre, but then I fainted at the sight of so much blood and had to be carried out myself into the sick bay to recover. Alex, another naval nurse, was ordered to look after me. When I came to, he was saying something to me, but I'm not sure what it was. But our eyes met, and I will never forget them. They were full of excitement. Afterwards, we struck up a friendship and spent most of our spare time on deck, watching the ship as it glided down the River St. Lawrence, with the trees lining the shoreline on either side in their glorious arrays of golden browns and light and dark of the evergreens. It was the fall. Such was our euphoria that we wrote poetry to each other.
After Stanley and Alex were demobbed, he went to live in Mansfield, a market town in Nottinghamshire, with Alex and Alex's widowed father, who had offered him a job as a trainee accountant. Stanley's dream had come true, and he was now able to train to become a professional accountant whilst living with Alex, his lover. For the first few months, he was able to get down to his studies. This involved attending the Technical College in Nottingham once a week, and also taking a correspondence course with a view to sitting exams of the Chartered Certified Accountants. But the honeymoon did not last. Stanley will now tell us about some of the shocking things that happened to him over the next 9 years that ended in a breakdown and a spell in a mental hospital.
The first bombshell, when Alex's father thought that I should get digs in town. In other words, leave his son and him. No reason was given. A typist named Kate offered me digs with her parents. The next rude awakening was when I discovered that Alex, as well as enjoying intimate relationships with me, was also chatting up the girls at the Methodist Chapel, which we were both attending at the time. Alex turned out to be bisexual, something which totally mystified me. Alex also flirted with Kate, the typist, and her parents, who had obviously observed the situation, confronted him about his behaviour and demanded that he made up his mind as to whom he was courting. The outcome was that he married Kate and dropped me like a hot brick. Nevertheless, Alex asked me to be his best man, which I found very embarrassing, to say the least. I was now on the move again and had to find fresh digs.
Stanley's sense of rejection and feeling the odd man out increased exponentially as time went on. Soon he became aware of the church's attitude towards homosexuals, who mistakenly believed that, according to the Bible, being queer was a sin and an abomination of God. Then Stanley happened to read Peter Wildblood's book, Against the Law, which Wildblood had written after he'd been released from prison after serving 2 years for the crime of sexual indecency. Stanley realized that had his love affair with Alex been known to the police, both he and Alex would have been sent to prison too. He was not only an abomination to God, but, in the eyes of the law, he was also a criminal. But now for the coup de grace.
In the meantime, Alex became very enthusiastic about his Christian faith, and from his reading of the Bible became convinced that homosexuality was evil. He was anxious that I should marry a girl like he had done, and he took literally the story of Jesus in the New Testament of casting out demons, and was convinced that he would deliver me from my demon, which was, of course, my homosexuality. I agreed, somewhat reluctantly, I think, to let Alex perform an exorcism in the presence of some friends. We met in the schoolroom of the chapel one dark November morning. After explaining to those present, Alex, with a great show of enthusiasm and extempore prayer, commanded the demon to come out of me. Well, nothing happened. There was no demon, of course, and Annie blamed me for my lack of faith. Instead, my confidence had been totally shattered, and I was in such despair, I went to my GP and asked if I could be taken out of circulation, as though I was no good for this world. I spent 3 weeks in the mental hospital where I was given electric current therapy.
After many further attempts to change his sexual orientation, which failed miserably, and I'll leave you to read about these for yourselves, Stanley decided that the only way to live was to pretend to be a straight man. Even after the passing of the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, it was still not safe to come out, to be open about one's homosexuality. Some men got married in order to hide what society and the church still regarded as offensive and a sin. The only way to protect oneself from homophobia and abuse was to pretend to be a straight man. Passing, it was called. Even this strategy was not foolproof, as the story which Stan is now going to tell us shows.
I was now in my early 40s when it happened. By this time, I had fulfilled my ambition and had qualified as an accountant and had gone into partnership with 2 other accountants who were married and had children. I met them whilst attending some lectures on taxation at what was then the City of London College in Moorgate. One day, I was called into the senior partner's office where the younger partner pointed out some figures he had stumbled across from the partnership books of account. It turned out that the senior partner had been living beyond his means for years and was financing his gambling and drinking habits by plundering the client's account. These were monies usually from tax refunds which were temporarily retained but were due to be sent to the clients. The missing money amounted to several £1,000s. Exactly how much I can't remember, but enough to scare the pants off anybody. This, of course, was theft and had to be repaid, otherwise we ran the risk of bankruptcy and worse. The other solution was for each of the partners to raise money from their respective properties by means of a second mortgage. This was the moment when my cover was blown. I was living with my friend James at the time. We had bought a house together, and he adamantly refused to sign the necessary legal documents involved in raising a second mortgage. The cat was out the bag. The partners immediately jumped to the conclusion that I was queer and living with my lover. I can't begin to tell you the abuse I had to put up with when the senior partner realized that I was one of them.
There was a cruel incident which showed exactly what his partners thought about queers. Stanley was at a Christmas drinks party with the staff. This included an exchange of presents which were opened in front of each other. When it came to Stanley's turn, he began peeling off the wrapping, only to discover that there were many layers to it. When he eventually got to the contents, it turned out to be a toilet roll. He tried to pass it off as a joke, but it was terribly humiliating and hurtful. It was obvious what his partners really thought of him. Shit. Now let Stanley tell you what happened next.
The consequences of this cruel joke for me were disastrous. I was full of guilt about going into partnership with a man who wasted money on riotous living, had thrown to wind all those hard lessons I had learned about thrift and modest living, having been brought up in poverty. I was reminded of something my father used to say to me when my brother and I got into trouble. "Yo, big un, ought to have known better." Worst of all, my homosexuality had been exposed. My depression descended upon me like a black cloud, and my sleeping hours were full of bad dreams, and I often woke up in terror. There were many times in the past when I had planned flight from my difficult circumstances, but had always chickened out at the last minute. But this time, I was determined to commit suicide. I knew just the place, the Tamar suspension bridge over the River Tamar in Devon. Some time ago, I read that it was a favourite spot where people ended their lives. Here I was, 43, still being bullied and threatened, and now planning the final act of suicide to end once and for all my misery. The thought obsessed me for days, but gradually my courage failed. Somehow, there was something or someone who was determined that I should survive. It was Albert Camus, the French philosopher, who hit the nail on the head when he wrote in his book, A Happy Death. In the end, he said, it needs more courage to live than to kill oneself. Ultimately, I found the courage to press on. I left the partnership, and to hell with the consequences. I found a small office just off Berkeley Square and started to practice on my own account again. The stout refusal to sign away our home by James and my courage to survive had saved the day.
Stanley joined another firm of accountants, but experienced the same hostility when they twigged that he was gay. Fed up with the profession, he joined a religious order, and this experience seemed to restore his confidence, and he stayed for 5 years. During this time, he had also been an assistant to the chaplain at the Kent and Canterbury Hospital. Stanley was then accepted by the Canterbury Diocese for training for the priesthood. Muriel, a widow who was a visitor to the friary where he'd been living, offered him digs, where he could stay during the 3 years training at the Canterbury School of Ministry. Muriel and Stanley got on very well together. As she'd been a teacher, she helped him enormously with his studies, especially typing and correcting his essays and thesis, which had to be submitted at the end of each term. I will now let Stanley tell you what happened next.
One afternoon, I was in the study, and there was a knock on the front door. There stood Muriel's brother and his wife, asking if they could come in and talk to me. Muriel was out at the time. I barely knew them, but Muriel had told me a lot about them, which was not very flattering, to say the least. Apparently, they had pretended to buy one of Muriel's properties, which her late husband had left her. On the day contracts were due to be exchanged, it turned out that her brother hadn't got a penny to his name. Apparently, his wife had spent all their savings on her hobby, horses, the love of her life. As they still had young children, Muriel refused to take them to court for fraud and trespass and let them steal the house without paying a penny. They were obviously up to their tricks again. They assumed wrongly that Muriel and I were an item, having been seen together at the theatre in Canterbury and at one of the village churches. Without further ado, they demanded from me a promise that I would never marry Muriel. I was absolutely dumbfounded. And like Elizabeth Bennet in Jane Austen's famous novel Pride and Prejudice, stoutly refused to make any such promise. It was obviously that they were terrified that they would lose their cash cow if Muriel married again. And they could not allow such a thing to happen if they could help it. When Muriel returned home, I told her about her brother and sister-in-law's visit, and she was very upset. On reflection, I realised that Muriel had indeed fallen in love with me. Earlier, she told me that her first husband was gay and that their marriage had never been consummated. And I comforted myself with the thought that she would not make the same mistake again. I never told her that I was gay because the church at large was still in denial and gay priests still colluded with the silence on the subject. Muriel, of course, never declared her feelings and ultimately came to terms with the situation, and we remained great friends until she died, not long before I came to live at Charterhouse in 2003.
Not only do gay men who pretend to be straight run the risk of their cover being blown, but also being the object of matchmakers and the unwanted attentions of single and widowed ladies. You may laugh.
A bachelor gay am I, though I suffered from Cupid's dart, but never I vow will I say die in spite of an aching heart. For a man always loves a girl or two, though the facts must be confessed. He always swears the whole way through. To every girl he tries to woo, that he loves the father best.
Well done. Peter Dawson's song, A Bachelor Gay Am I, was no joy for Stanley. He never wanted to be a homosexual in the first place, but wished he could have married and have had children of his own. Finding himself the object of attention by women was very confusing and resulted in a lot of hurt and misunderstanding all round, to say nothing of how such events fueled his depression. Thank goodness such situations are less likely to happen today, when Stanley can now be open about who he really is. I hope you've enjoyed listening to these extracts from Stanley's autobiography, and what you have heard has whetted your appetite to read the book for yourselves. Let Stanley have the last word.
Having now reached the age of 92, I've seen a lot of changes in our society, despite the troubled times in which we now live. Over the years, our country has become a kinder and more tolerant place as regards our sexuality. We do not choose our sexuality, it is given us, and this has now been accepted and understood as never before. The two main branches of the Christian church in our country are still struggling with homosexuality and other gender issues. But the bastions of prejudice, where gay people are not welcome, are gradually falling. but for some it is still work in progress. Even so, I'm reminded that while I have been at Charterhouse, I met the son of a parishioner from my Dymchurch days. He was now grown up and worked at Bart's Hospital. He and his friend used to come and visit me. Brett told me that he had AIDS and died quite suddenly. His friend caught the AIDS from him and was determined to follow him to the grave. He booked a room at a local hotel and was found hanged the next morning. I was absolutely devastated. Even recently, my brother, who still lives in the Black Country, told me of a relative of his late wife, Paul, who was in his 30s and was in the wardrobe department of a well-known theatre and was found hanged in the bedroom of his digs. So I was saddened, of course, last Saturday, if you remember, last Saturday morning when I read in The Guardian that hate crimes against people with different sexual orientation has doubled in the past 5 years. You may think it strange that I became a priest in an organisation which has such problems with homosexuality. Well, throughout history, the church has had its blind spots. One has only to think of the struggle it had to abolish slavery, and more recently, the terrible system of apartheid in South Africa. But I'm in good company, as Jesus challenged the religious authority of his day as to their appalling treatment of people like the tax collectors and ethnic groups. My purpose in writing this book was motivated by the belief that my story would be helpful to others who found themselves with similar issues. I also wanted to thank people who over the past 50 years have made our society and the church aware of the untold suffering of people who could not conform to the binary model of sexuality. Whilst the book is inevitably about life down in the valleys, there are stories of life on the mountaintops too. Ultimately, I came to terms with my homosexuality. Instead of hating myself, I found how to love what God had made in the first place. I overcame my fear, the root of all phobias. Sadly, our world has always found it difficult to cope with difference. One has only to think of present-day racism, anti-Semitism, and other cultures which we fear. If only we could learn to embrace and accept the great variety and wonder of God's world. Can I leave you with a final thought? It's a proverbial saying which comes from William Cowper, an 18th century poet, and he says this: variety is the very spice of life, which gives life all its flavour. Thank you.
Before we finally bring this talk to an end, I wonder if any of you have any questions which you would like to ask Stanley. I'm sure he'd be willing to answer them if he can.
Yes. Please stand up, yes.
I've had a similar experience in you as well, with mental health issues and through sexuality, being rejected and coming from an Irish Roman Catholic background.
Yes.
And suffered with depression. But I still feel there is discrimination in the LGBT community of older gay.
Could you speak up a little more?
I feel there's still a lot of discrimination in the LGBT community,
yes,
against people with any kind of depression or mental health issues. And I experienced quite a lot from gay men and straight people.
So what is your question? Yeah.
My question was, it was very interesting to hear your side, yes, because obviously I'm younger than you and what you've done, and it's really interesting for me. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Well, yes, it took a long time to work through. I'm told that by the medical profession that unpleasant experiences, the emotion of unpleasant experience, reside in a part of the brain and continue to be alerted when similar circumstances arrive, and that throws us. And we really have to do come to terms with the demons within us, and accept them, and learn to love who we are, not to hate, because that's what we're doing. We're hating ourselves. I think it's a very difficult and precarious journey, but that's how I found peace. You've got to expose those demons and get them out of your system. I hope that you might find ultimately release from your depressions.
Any other questions, Michael?
Yes, Leo.
Thank you, Stanley.
Sorry.
Is it me?
Leo.
Yes, go ahead, Michael.
Go on, Michael.
I already knew your story because I'd read the book, but it was good to hear it again, and your courage in... I'm 76, so I'm aware of the place of homosexuality in the world for the last 50 years or so. And to state it more positively, I hardly remember any of my gay friends having a hard time. They had a great time, most of them, going right back as far as college. Luckily, our generation and beyond, on the whole, are much more open-minded about sexuality than the earlier generations.
Yes. Well, of course, I was born in the 20s, and of course, I was born in a particular part of the country where people were not educated. I mean, this is not. I mean, they just were, and they were ignorant, and they imbibed the folklore and the acculturization of the bits of scripture and so on. Although they wouldn't be able to quote where they got the idea that God hated gays from, they're somehow in their thinking, you were a bugger or something like that. They got it in their mind, and of course, one must have to attribute to it to the church's teaching, which was enculturized in our normal life. But of course, the influence of that has gradually got better over the years.
We have a question over here.
Leo.
As it was never a legal issue in Latin countries.
Sorry.
So, as it was never a legal issue in Latin countries, and I'm sure it never came up in families as it did in England, where it was illegal. What impressed me recently, at least 2 years ago, were the widows of Morecambe and Wise, who we all know had formed a relationship in their very young years as a comedy duo. And when they both died, their widows were speaking on the radio, and Mrs. Morecambe made a statement which moved me greatly. She said, "You know, those two men really did love each other." And I thought that was a wonderful thing to say for a married woman, because I think the male bonding has been something peculiar to men, which perhaps females don't have.
Yes.
What do you feel?
Well, it was lovely that she recognized the male bonding, which of course most people do. Our culture denied male bonding, didn't it? There are people that did come to terms with male bonding, but it's now very acceptable, isn't it?
As well as female bonding.
Yes.
We have a question.
Yes, Leo, please.
I was just wondering what your relationship with Alex was after you became this.
Well, of course, I was hurt and distressed, but he went off to form a Pentecostal teaching establishment, went off to Africa and pursued his fundamentalist Christian interpretation of the Christian faith. And ultimately, when he came back to England, he moved to Cornwall and formed house churches with his particular brand of Christianity. He lived a very happy family life, And sadly, there was never any opportunity for rapprochement, although I saw him at intervals there afterwards. I even went to his 50th wedding anniversary, and it was the most terrible experience because it brought all the tension and all the horror back of the ending of my relationship with him and the exorcism. But he himself, I think, was quite oblivious to the suffering he caused. And he lived a very happy life, and I met some of his family. And I don't really believe the lady he married really was aware of his bisexuality. I mean, it was sad that we never really straightened this out, but they were things, I'm afraid, die, and you can never make ready in this life, opposite in the next.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say we had living at Charthouse one of the bravest soldiers of the Second World War, Brigadier Calvert,
yes,
who founded the Chindits, one of the bravest soldiers fighting in the Burma campaign. And he was caught in a club in Berlin in the 50s, and it was for boys only or men only. And he was discharged, even though he'd left the army. He was his pension was discharged.
Yes.
It was taken away from him, and he found himself in Australia working as a farmer. He was treated disgracefully.
Oh, yes.
And Ord Wingate at his funeral service said it was an absolute, Ord Wingate's son, I should say, said it was an absolute disgrace how that man had been treated after he had fought so bravely in the Second World War. And I went to his memorial service, and all these soldiers came in with his medals, and there was no question about him being a coward or a poofter or a Nancy boy or whatever the term was in those days.
Yes, he was a very brave man and treated abominably. But of course, you know, the government, 2003, passed a law to expunge the criminal charges of about 40,000 criminal prosecutions.
Stanley, we have a question from over here, please.
Sorry. Two questions. What do you think about the progress that we've made within your lifetime in regarding to LGBT equality? And the second question is what you're looking forward to.
Well, general society has come to a greater understanding and awareness, and has lost much of its homophobia. But I'm afraid the Church, of which I'm a member of the Church of England, they're still arguing the toss in the Synod, and the Roman Catholic Church are still in the dark woods. I mean, you know, the last but one Pope still maintains that the homosexuals were they intrinsically. His expression was they are intrinsically disordered. And it's terrible. But even so, there are people in the Roman Catholic Church that are really, really thinking very, very deeply about the implications of that doctrine and what it's doing to gay people in the church. The church is dragging its feet. I believe that the church will in 50 years' time, it'll not be a problem. But until they get sex out of their hair, they're not going to make any progress.
The sex mad.
I'm afraid so.
Any more questions?
Sir.
Yes, just touching on what the man's second question there was. What do you think about the current LGBT community, the slight fetishisation of drag queens and the homosexuality that appears on TV, and indeed the general acceptance of it? Do you feel that's part of your community, or do you think that's something different?
Sexual expression is as varied as the rainbow and is a spectrum. So I mean, this is how people feel. I have no problem with it. I mean,
have you ever been to a pride?
Well, no. You have to understand that whilst I was a priest and the church was in the closet and I was in the closet, if I declared that I was a homosexual, I was likely to be either disgraced by the congregation or ousted by the church. And so until I retired in 1992, it was only then that the church started to speak about what had been a silent warfare throughout all the years. It was only in the 90s that the church started to admit that there were homosexuals in their midst, and that it was a problem. I mean, it was swept under the carpet and everybody pretended. I mean, it's the most amazing situation for an organisation that believes in truth. And yet I'm afraid this was the case.
Stanley, we have a question right at the back there,
yes.
sir.
And it still is a disgrace, isn't it, Stanley?
Yes, of course, yes, it is.
The churches and other faith communities managed under a Labour government, as it happens,
yes.
to gain for themselves unbelievably exemptions and privileges which allowed them to discriminate lawfully in a way which they've never clearly been able to do in the past.
Yeah.
So we're actually all living in a climate where it is less free for us, whether we're LGBT or straight but in support of us,
yeah.
To say and do what we wish to do
yes.
without fear of recrimination. We are living in a climate of increased intolerance, legally justified by a Labour government. After the abolition of Section 28,
yes.
most people thought, well, that's the end of state sponsorship of persecution. It was not. The faith communities entered into an unhealthy tryst with the government of the day and said, right, if you want to get rid of Section 28, fine by us, but we want something in return. What they got in return is the power to discriminate, and they do it unmercifully.
Yes. It's a very sad state of affairs as far as the church is concerned. They're still hypocritical.
Mike, the back.
Well, Stanley and I, being in the church, we really see that the discrimination is, I suppose, prosecuted, is that the right word, by the hierarchy, not the people in the congregation. In our church...
Can you stand, Mike? We can't hear you.
I'm a churchgoer and I'm gay, and I'm the church warden, and all our priests, up to the current one, have been gay. And one of the parishioners, who's 90-odd, said to me one day, do you know, thank God I've never had communion from a homosexual. And I said to myself, yeah. Okay. So the church is not a pernicious place where gay people are punished and everything like that. In fact, the church that I go to, half the congregation are gay, I'm going to say. And so you have to divorce the reality from people who are posturing.
But we are getting better.
Stanley will tell you that there are a few churches in London which are not very Christian.
Yep, I'm afraid so. We have a family living in our complex at the Charterhouse who are terribly homophobic, and they belong to a particular section of the church, which is very distressing, I assure you.
Stanley, we just have two final questions.
Yes.
And then, obviously, once we've concluded completely, do feel free to ask Stanley questions individually. Sir?
I just wanted to bring a little bit of hope. There is a part of the Anglican Communion that isn't the Church of England in these islands. In Scotland, I'm a priest of the Scottish Episcopal Church, which actually agreed to have same-sex marriage in church.
Yep.
I was talking to one of my colleagues in Edinburgh, and he said, well, I thought it was only fair. I didn't see why only heterosexuals should suffer.
Very good, yes. Well, I think the Church of England will come to it in the end, but they take their time.
Stanley, you've expressed the view that the Church within 50 years will have come round to full acceptance. Of homosexuality.
Yes.
But what about Islam and the Muslim community? They seem to me to be becoming even more intense against homosexuality.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid I don't very much know, except that I'm aware of their terrible prejudice in some quarters. But I think you have to understand that the Muslim didn't go for a reformation like we did in the 17th century, and therefore there was no reformation of their faith. And of course, until there is a reformation within Islam, I don't think their views will change very much.